Hi, Trade Guys listeners. I'm Naveen Girishankar, president of the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department and the host of CSIS's newest podcast, Betting on America, where we explore the global technology race and what it'll take for the United States to come out on top. Join me as I sit down with leaders from business and government to understand the risks and the rewards of investing in the technologies and industries of the future in a community near you. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to learn how and why we are betting on America.
I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
Coming up next on this most awesome episode of The Trade Guys, we will talk auto tariffs, tariffs to U.S. businesses, and we will start out with a whole discussion about EU tariffs, all coming up on this next episode of The Trade Guys. Boys, we're back with another episode of The Trade Guys, and before we get into it, and we are going to get into it, Scott has something very important to say. Over to you, Scott.
Well, thanks, Andrew. And it's a typical shameless plug. But once a year, Bill and I team up for a course in trade policy. It's called Crash Course with the Trade Guys. And it's basically the fundamentals of U.S. trade policy and politics done in 2 half days. So lots of places to go learn about trade in Washington. But what Bill and I try to offer is a time-efficient program. So it's May 8th and 9th, runs from about 9 to 2 p.m. We also offer basically a seminar format. Enrollment is capped at 25, and we keep the group small so we can interact and answer your questions and be at your disposal for a couple of days of intensive discussion, and hopefully you walk away with a better understanding of what's going on. So that's Crash Course with the Trade Guys. You'll find it at csis.org/executive education, and enrollment's open now.
I love it. You know what it's like? It's like you guys are like the Avengers of Trade Guys. You know, it's like teaming up Iron Man with Spider-Man, and it is something that everybody should get a crash course from the Avenger Trade Guys.
I think of it more as Deadpool, you know. But okay, if you want
Either way.
if you want to go with the Avengers, that's fine, but I'm thinking Deadpool.
All right, I'm more of an Avengers guy, but I see your point, and we can call it that too. All right, guys. Tariff Man is at it. And, you know, the stock market likes it and it doesn't like it and it likes it. And I don't know what the hell's going on. You guys do. Let's start with the trade war that we're having with Europe. Is it limited to tariffs on goods, or could it extrapolate to services as well?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes. And we're heading in that direction. And I think this is going to be the big news of April 2nd if they stick to their timetable, which, as Andrew just implied, is variable. You know, if you look at last week or the last 2 weeks, tariffs were on, then they were off, then they were double, and then they were back to what they were before, and then they were off again. So you really can't say with certainty until probably midnight of April 1st what is going to happen. But I'm expecting Europe to be a major victim here, and that's going to be enormous because trade with them, you know, total trade both ways, was $1.3 trillion last year. That's trillion with a T, more than half of which was services. And our deficit with them, the whole European Union, I'm talking about here, was $235 billion, which is not a small number. I mean, each individual country, of course, is less, but if you take them all together, it's a big chunk. And I think Trump is going to figure out a way to go after that. He regularly rails at the EU and, in fact, accused the entire entity as being created to do bad things to the United States, which is a real distortion of history. But, you know, I think when they created the EU, the last thing they were thinking about was the United States. But, you know, let him think what he wants. It appears that what's going to happen, and this is all speculation.
Bill, he is definitely going to think what he wants. I can tell you of that, I am certain.
No question. In this case, the gossip as of today, which is March 20th, is that rather than do what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, which is have reciprocal tariffs on every separate tariff line for every separate country, which would be 2.6 million tariff lines roughly, they're going to have one number for each country. And that number probably will be the average tariff plus the value-added tax, even though that's sales tax, plus some unspecified amount for whatever unfair trade practices the administration deems the other country to be engaging in, which means they can pick any number they want and get away with it. And it means for Europe, for the European Union anyway, there will be 27 numbers. And my expectation is they won't all be the same, even though the common tariff is the same. The VAT is not the same in Europe. They range between 15 and 27%, depending on the country. And he will invent different unfair trade practices in different countries. So for Denmark, because of Greenland, expect a bigger number. For Hungary, because he's a buddy with Orban, expect a smaller number. This is a divide and conquer strategy, which I think long-term is aimed at trying to break up the European Union. They are right now wrestling with what to do about this. I think right now they're thinking manufacturers, not services. We've talked about that before. Trump is a old-style, heavy manufacturing guy. He thinks steel, aluminum, cars, machinery, the stuff we used to make in the 50s and 60s. That's what he wants. And he doesn't talk about services very often, even though our economy is 75% services. The one service he started to talk about, though, is the digital services tax, which I know Scott will have something to say about, which a number of European countries, not all of them, but a number of European countries have imposed on U.S., mostly U.S., digital service providers, including large platforms like Google, Apple, Meta, and things like that. And they have delayed implementation of the tax, even though they've enacted it, pending negotiations in the OECD to try to produce an overall scheme for digital taxation. And that bought time, basically, because the Biden administration was heavily engaged in those negotiations, and the other countries, for the most part, held off on assessing the tax. But one of the first things Trump did when he came in was to pull out of those talks. So there's no more time to buy. And by doing that, what he did was basically authorize these other countries to go ahead and impose the tax on us. I assume he figures then he'll add that into what he's planning for the Europeans. They have to figure out what to do. They have to figure out what to retaliate, how to retaliate, whether to retaliate. And they have to figure out how to cope with a strategy that I think is deliberately designed to break them up and to play favorites. So it's going to be a big deal, I think. This volume of trade, the size of the tariffs I think that he's going to impose are going to be large. The other rumor, of course, is that he's going to give everybody a number on April 2nd. He may not necessarily impose the tariffs on April 2nd because he wants countries to come in and offer to negotiate and basically say, we'll lower our tariffs if you take yours back to where they used to be, which means really no concession on our part, but a significant one on their part. The problem he'll have with Europe is that individual countries can't come in and have that negotiation because they're bound by the common tariff policy of the European Union. So he's going to end up negotiating with Ursula von der Leyen and the Commission. Scott, fill me in on what I didn't cover.
Well, I agree this will end in a negotiation, but let me just make a couple of observations. First, I think part of the reason that we're having a tough time figuring this out is that the president and his team have chosen a very simple communication strategy, which is a very complex in execution. The simple communication strategy is we want reciprocity. And reciprocity is a simple idea. It's one that's very appealing to voters. We want to charge what you charge. Okay? If you give us low rates, we'll give you low rates. And that all makes sense. But as Bill put it with his count up of tariff lines, implementing that is amazingly difficult and probably beyond the capability of negotiators to really grasp. So that's why nobody knows what's going on, because when they start to think about the real implications of a line-by-line negotiation or line-by-line reciprocity, it's horrific. So that's number one. Number two, I think there's something more behind all this than breaking up the EU. I think it is that what the president really wants is for the Europeans to stop pretending that it's 1949. And that goes for both economic and security relationships. He's been pretty clear as the Ukraine ceasefire and negotiations have gone on that U.S. taxpayers have picked up the tab for 75 years for European security, and that's enough. EU security is the EU problem. And wrapped into that is EU trade policy, also goes back to the common agricultural policy, the famines after World War II. And so American negotiators are awfully tired of hearing, sorry, we can't buy your farm products because we've regulated them to become illegal. Because More importantly, they compete with our farmers. We can't have that. And so while we have occasionally collaborated in the last sort of 30 years or so, and we did with the single market and the accessions of former Soviet bloc countries into the European Union, which were very important for economic prosperity, a lot of times we don't cooperate. In fact, I've known every deputy USTR, the ambassador in Geneva since, I guess, Lynette Diley in 2001. And every single one of them, Republican or Democrat, has concluded that the European operation is an anti-U.S. op. That's why they're there. So there are a lot of frustrations that trace back to that. But at the end of the day, I think you wind up with a negotiation. That's probably a U.S. and EC negotiation. So it's going to be a mess getting there, but I think that's what's really behind it.
All right. So guys, how is this really going to affect U.S. consumers though? Is European wine becoming more expensive in the United States? And I know on the other side of our producers, the bourbon folks are not too happy right now.
Boats, bourbon, motorcycles. There's a benefit here for Harley Davidson. Soybeans, beef, chicken, other agriculture items. They've announced they're holding off the immediate retaliation, which is going to be later this month. And they postponed it to mid-April, I think because they want to see what we do before they decide what they're going to do, which is probably smart on their part. Because with Trump, it may be completely different from everything I just said, depending on what happens over the next few days. But the first tranche that they planned was, let me put it this way, what they've already announced really was only in response to steel and aluminum. They haven't even gotten to the reciprocal tariffs that we were just talking about. For steel and aluminum, that's the boats, the bourbon, the motorcycles. Basically what they did is they took the list that they imposed in 2018, 2019, when Trump imposed the steel tariffs the first time, and then that ended up being suspended. We suspended ours, our steel and aluminum tariffs. They suspended their retaliation, and there was a lengthy negotiation throughout the entire Biden administration that produced no resolution. And the administration ended with the Europeans having agreed to postpone their retaliation until this month, and the Biden administration having agreed to postpone their tariffs until the end of this year, which I doubt that Trump will stick with. So from the European standpoint, they are simply reinstating what they announced 5 years ago or 6 years ago, whenever it was. And then they further announced additional things beyond that, totaling about 18 billion euros worth of stuff, mostly the ag products.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we go with the reciprocal thing that we were just talking about, that's going to be even bigger than steel and aluminum. And there, I think that they were right to postpone announcing what they're going to do because they want to see what we do and see how big it will be. So right now, nobody's paying anything. But if you drink wine, yes, you're almost certainly going to get hit.
And you just said it. And I want to ask Scott, our exports, look, they're messing with one of my favorite industries here is bourbon. As everybody who listens to this podcast knows, our friends in Kentucky cannot be too happy about this. What about it?
Well, it's a good time to be patriotic and buy American whiskey, I say.
Yeah, as everyone should.
Yeah, it'll be a mess. And obviously, there were a lot of photos from Canadian liquor stores where they basically took all the American whiskey off the shelves. And it's like, well, good. Well, Canadian Club is like pond water.
Terrible.
Let the Canadians drink their own slop.
Yeah, they can drink their own side.
Leave us the Buffalo Trace. Yeah.
They do make a nice bourbon and rye called Whistle Pig, but we don't need that.
Yeah.
Well, keep in mind on the European side, in a way, the list is out of date because it was comprised to try to hit at the districts or states of congressional leaders. Bourbon's on the list because of Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell's not the Republican leader anymore.
And he's retiring.
Yes.
So, and he's going to retire. He's not going to run for re-election. So he's only good really for another year and a half. So they're probably searching for something in South Dakota.
Yes.
Yeah.
That they can add to the list. And we'll see.
And a lot of this, frankly, never works. Okay. They go to a lot of effort to try to get individual senators and put pressure on them, but it seldom works.
It never makes any difference.
Yeah.
But it allows them to provide a rationale for what they're doing.
Right.
Well, guys, I'm going to be on a campaign. Scott just said it. Drink more U.S. bourbon.
Yep.
And you don't just have to drink it from Kentucky. They make bourbon all over this country. It's not technically allowed to be called bourbon, of course, unless it's made in Kentucky with Kentucky limestone water. But I will say there's some places out west that make some really good bourbon.
There's some terrific rye from New York, which was Always the original Manhattan cocktail was probably made with New York rye whiskey.
Probably, that's right.
Back before Prohibition.
That's right.
And those whiskeys are back now from specialty distillers. There's a lot of innovation in the field. It's a great time to sample what's new and special about the American spirits industry.
That's right. Buy American. Buy Levi's jeans. They're great.
Yep.
Buy Ford and GM trucks. They're great.
You know, we should be careful about this. Secretary Lutnick just told everybody to buy Teslas, and he's getting in trouble for that since he's a public official.
Okay, well, we're not.
We're not, so I guess we can do it, but we have to be a little bit cautious, I think.
Yes.
Well, my dad used to have a Tesla, so, you know, good cars.
Really?
Yeah, he did.
Well,
Did he get rid of it in protest?
The lease ran out, and he's been sort of, you know, I won't say he definitely still drives, but they're going down to one car.
yep, that's understand. That happens.
God bless him.
He was a pioneer if he had an early Tesla.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, let me know when they light a fire under it and blow it up.
You know, that's just straight up terrorism. I mean, it really, you know, we don't want to see political violence in this country. We don't want to see domestic terrorism in this country, and blowing up these dealerships or these cars, it sickens me. Sorry, that's my rant for the day, guys.
I agree completely. So,
yeah.
Anyway, our next topic is cars from North America.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk regional. So how many tariffs actually impact the job market here in the United States?
Well, we don't know, but one of the things that is being watched carefully in the tensions between U.S. and Canada are tariffs on autos. This is what happens when you leave markets alone, because, believe it or not, 1965 was the date that Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, and Lester Pearson agreed on what's been known as the Auto Pact, which preceded NAFTA, preceded USMCA, but auto trade has been integrated, therefore auto production has been integrated in North America since 1965. And in 60 years' time, what happened is that we learned to make things together and sell them to each other. And there wasn't much made of the national border. As Bill and I were discussing before the show started, the only geographic feature that really matters in automotive production is Interstate 95, which connects in Detroit,
75.
Windsor.
75.
Yes, I'm sorry. 75, which runs from Florida all the way to Detroit. You cross the Ambassador Bridge to Windsor, and it's Highway 401 goes all the way to Oshawa. So it's southern Ontario to the sort of the Midwest, starting it with Detroit. The I-75 corridor is where almost every assembly plant and many, many of the suppliers of those auto plants are located along that corridor. And that's the one you could see that from space in terms of the level of activity. But it is not differentiated by country because there hasn't been a trade barrier in 65 years or 60 years.
And they're going to get hit the hardest by the tariffs because, as we've explained before, because the industry is so integrated, partial assemblies of cars go back and forth across the border 5 or 6 times. And the way this is structured, they're going to pay a tariff every time. I mean, this is going to be really fatal for the industry.
That's why they're either seeing administration officials, as many as they can talk to, about the reality of their business.
The other element is we're beginning to learn that the tariffs are, as a Canadian friend just was telling me today, stackable, which means they stack on top of each other. So if Trump does what he says he's going to do, we're going to have a 25% tariff on everything from Canada and Mexico, plus a 25% tariff on cars. So that's 50%. Plus a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, which is a lot of the car. So at the end of the day, what you're talking about here is a tariff on Canadian and Mexican cars that's going to be approaching 70%. This is prohibitive. I mean, who is going to do that?
That's a recipe for failure of the industry.
And that then brings you to the timing issue. You know, Trump's response to that is, well, if they make them here, you know, nothing to worry about. Well, you know, they do make most of them here, as it turns out. But the decision to move here and make more production here turns out to be a really complicated decision. It takes a long time to do that. And Stellantis, for example, announced that they were going to retool one of their plants.
Belvidere, Illinois. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Their plant in Illinois. They announced in 2023 that they're going to do that, and they're expecting this plant to come online in 2027. So 4 years to retool an existing plant. So if you're going to talk about building a new one, it's probably going to be longer than that. Meanwhile, everybody's going to be paying tariffs.
All right. So let's finally talk about the auto industry. And, you know, we've talked about this a little bit, but what is the estimated cost increase per vehicle?
$3,000 to $12,000 per car, depending upon who you talk to. big range, partly because there's multiple models, partly because there are also different economic analysis firms that have come to different conclusions.
A lot is the answer.
I mean, that is a lot. So it begs the question, why do tariffs have greater negative effects on smaller businesses if big business like autos, that's a big number?
Well, yes. And small businesses don't have the leverage and don't have the offices in Washington and the ability to explain to elected officials how this affects them. And they often they're price takers. I remember during I guess it was the Clinton administration, where there was a WTO case that went to so-called retaliation. And there were some people selling plumbing fixtures and things like that who were on that list. And they went to see that time Ambassador Charlene Barshevsky and didn't have really much of a say in what was on or off that list. So they wind up being price takers. Essentially, it's a difficult spot for the small businesses.
This is going to show up in autos with the parts people.
Yeah.
The parts and component people and steel aluminum people. A lot of the steel aluminum contracts are fixed price contracts, so they can't, within the life of the contract, bump the price up, even though there's going to be a tariff. I mean, they'll renegotiate the contract at some point. And a lot of the auto parts people are smaller guys. And it's what Scott said, they don't have the leverage. The assembly, the Fords, the GMs, the Stellantises, they can raise the price. They can pass some of this on consumers, which is what we were just talking about. But the parts guys often are not in a position to force Ford or GM into paying them more.
But the good news is that in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, March 19th, the trade guys were vindicated because there was a wonderful article on the history of the chicken tax.
Chicken tax.
Bill's talked about chlorinated chicken and the chicken tax for years.
My favorite rant.
It's an oldie but a goodie.
It sure is. It's an excellent article, by the way, because it goes all the way back to the dispute with Europe over chicken that traces to 1962 is when the fight started.
As I was reading it, Scott, I heard both of your voices explaining the history and, the chicken tax and its situation.
It's really a very well done piece. My compliments to Stephen Wilmot, who is has byline on this. It's very well done. And it talks about the fact that after all these years of a 25% tax on light trucks, virtually all pickup trucks sold in the United States are made in North America. So you'd expect that. And he also points out, though, that nobody really pays the chicken tax because either you assemble it here or you work around it. And the article even includes a wonderful picture of the Subaru Brat, a very famous workaround, which was a pickup truck where they bolted 2 seats in the bed and called it a car.
And got away with it for a year or two.
Got away with it.
And that is your favorite example, Scott.
That's right.
I only think about the Brat when you talk about it.
It's wonderful to see that. And it turns out that Mercedes-Benz did something similar when they introduced the Sprinter van. They bolted seats in the back and called it a passenger van, which wasn't subject to the chicken tax. But they soon started manufacturing in their South Carolina plant. So this isn't really tariff evasion. But the other thing he does point out in the article that's important is that Americans probably have less choice of trucks, particularly at the low end, both smaller vehicles and lower price vehicles. Our trucks tend to be larger and more expensive as a result of the way the market's developed. And so I'm very fond of a BBC show called Top Gear. And Top Gear did this. They do a lot of weird little funny skits that test the durability or performance of cars. And the one vehicle they couldn't destroy was a Toyota Hilux pickup. It was a very basic vehicle, but it was essentially indestructible, according to the Top Gear guys. You could buy a Hilux in Mexico. You can't buy one in the U.S. because of the chicken tax. So there are differences, but all in all, excellent article. Thanks to the Wall Street Journal for running it. And so we're still fighting about chicken and we're still fighting about trucks. So,
yep. And that's the 2 lessons here, 2 quick lessons here. One is for every move in trade, there's a counter move.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So you put the tariff on and then Subaru invents the Brat.
That's the title of this podcast. For every move, there is a counter move.
Yep.
And the other one is these things don't always go away. I mean, as Scott pointed out, this started in 1962.
Right.
So what is it now? 50 plus years later, we still have...
63 as I counted.
Yeah, so. Okay, thank you. 63 years later. Your math is better than mine. 63 years later, we still can't get our chickens into Europe, and they still can't get their trucks in here.
A lot of stubborn politicians over a 63-year period.
You'd think that over that period of time, we ought to be able to solve this problem, but
we haven't.
We've not been able to. And in past episodes, I will not repeat this. I will spare you. I've gone through the litany of watching the EU try to deal with this. There are not a lot of innocent parties here. They started it.
Yeah.
They started it with the chickens. And, ironically then, the victims have turned out to be not just the European manufacturers, but mostly the Japanese and Korean small truck manufacturers. They're the ones who weren't even making these things in 1962, but now they take the big hit.
Oh, man.
Life goes on.
Chickens and trucks.
Yep.
That's what we talk about. Guys, as always, thank you for your amazing insight and for being such good sports about everything. Really appreciate it. I am out next week. So, I'll be back in a week past next week, and we'll look forward to talking to you then.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.